So if you could first off by introduce yourself. Yes.
Hi, I'm Stacey Gherardi, and I'm an assistant professor here in the School of Social Work, and I've done that. This is my second year here, and before that, for 8 years, I was a school social worker, mostly in a suburb right outside of Chicago, although demographically it was very similar to the city. So there's a lot of suburbs outside Chicago that, although they're suburbs, this is maybe not what you would think of in terms of suburban, still pretty urban. And so I worked there for about 8 years, and then before that I did my internship, my MSW internship in a much more suburban, kind of middle class suburb outside of Chicago. And before that, taught 4th grade in the city, downtown. So yeah, most of my work has been with kids in different capacities.
When did you decide to work with children?
When I graduated with my BSW, I did not know what I wanted to do, and I had done my internships at a domestic violence shelter and then at a community center for Latino immigrants in Indiana. And so that was more adult work at the community center and advocacy and organizing and that kind of stuff. And I did not know what I wanted to do in the field of social work. But felt like I wanted to do something where I was working with people early on, like before they were in crisis kind of thing. Like I didn't feel like I was equipped to go out there and do intense kind of crisis response type of work. And so I didn't know though what I wanted to do, and I had never thought about teaching before, and that's kind of what led me. I just started thinking about it, led me into considering teaching, and then Teach for America. I applied there and got accepted, so it's kind of a way for me to get into schools. And so when I was teaching, I was amazed at how difficult that job is, how much support teachers need, and how much of what I was doing was really social work, responding to behavior and supporting students in that way, and not really teaching or worrying about academics. But I really didn't feel like I knew how to do that well as a teacher, and so I ended up going back and got my MSW. And in Illinois, where I was, you have to get a specific specialization in schools in order to work in schools. So my MSW was very focused on social work in schools. My field placement was there. Most of the classes I took were very specific to work in schools, and then I ended up working in schools.
Has it become easier working with kids?
Yeah, because I think I didn't have any of those, even when I started teaching, didn't have any of those skills in terms of just engaging kids. It's a whole different skill set to learn how to interview kids, engage kids, work with kids. What does it look like? So yeah, over time you definitely learn a lot of tricks of the trade. Ways to get, especially I worked mostly with kids with different types of disabilities, but most of the kids I work with might have had some sort of disability, in terms of learning or language or things like that. So learning how to work around, if you can't communicate verbally with a kiddo, you can still work with them. So learning strategies for doing things very visually or very physically in order to work with people.
Your first encounter with child abuse?
My first. Thanks. Well, my first was as a teacher, and having to call as a teacher. As a social worker, though, it's in a different position, because people in the school tend to look to you for you do this is your job, even though the law says if you're if you're the teacher who a child disclosed to, the teacher really needs to make the call, not you as the social worker. But it's a scary thing for teachers, and they don't get the same type of training. They don't know. So a lot of times I would sit in the room with people and just kind of let them know what they would expect when they make that call. So I think the first time you do it, there's just this intimidation of not knowing, right? What is that worker going to be asking you? What does this mean? And I think once you've done it, you realize they're very helpful. The hotlines are typically, they're very helpful, very supportive. It becomes much more of a positive experience. At least you know what to expect, and you kind of learn, I think, over time, what our situation, what's the response going to be. So over time, I think I would start to know, I have to call, but they're not going to take this call. They're not going to investigate as a result of this call. I'm going to make the call so that it's documented. I'm going to make the call because I do have a concern, but I know that nothing's going to come of it. Or On the other hand, you know, like I know that they're immediately going to investigate this, and so kind of having a sense of having experience with the system is really helpful, at least to know some idea how this might shake out.
You mentioned the sense of experience. Has this led to the intuition of there is abuse happening?
I saw that. I thought that was a really good question. It was interesting. The weird thing about that is that, so, you know, I worked for 8 years, and it probably once a week, if not more, we would make a call, right? Or I would know, if I wasn't the one making it, somebody in the school would probably have to make a call. You know, it's a pretty common thing, at least it was where I was working, to have those concerns. And in all that time, I can think of 2 cases that were indicated, that were founded, right? That after they investigated, they had evidence that said, yes, something was going on. So it's a really high rate of calls. And not all those calls get investigated, but all of, you know, most of the investigations that I might have initiated in some way because I called, most of them turned out to be unfounded. So it's kind of an interesting question because, like, you know, so you might have this intuition, but you may never get confirmation that, yes, this happened, or no, it didn't. And even unfounded doesn't mean it didn't happen. It might just mean there's not enough evidence to say it did, right? And I think the kids that I probably have the highest, like, concern about might have been kids that there was nothing that would have prompted an investigation for. Like, they were very quiet, withdrawn kids, right? Not maybe kids who would speak up. Like, a lot of the calls we would make would be kids who often were in trouble at school, and then they would tell their teacher that they got in trouble at home because they were in trouble at school, and that the discipline was just excessive, right? And a lot of times in those situations, they were loving, caring parents who their own discipline, right, as kids was very physical, and they were trying to help the school. Like, that's the way they saw it. Like, I keep getting these calls from school, and I'm trying to get my kids straight because I'm trying to help them, right? I don't want them to do this at school, and I don't want the school to have to deal with it. So, you know, like, the majority of the calls that we dealt with were that, at least in terms of a kid disclosing something, or maybe even coming to school with a mark or something like that. You know, and typically those might be unfounded if it was just that the kid said something, or even if they were indicated, it would get worked out within the family. But I think the kids that, like, stick out to me is I had a feeling that something was going on, or maybe those kids who never disclosed anything. There was never any, like, clear, you know, just those red flag type things, but nothing that would have ever triggered an investigation because they never disclosed anything. They never had any physical marks that we saw. And those kids, it's more like those situations, I'd say, of chronic neglect, probably, you know, that are hard to kind of tease out and hard to figure out, and hard sometimes to get a call made for, because it's a fine line, the difference between neglect and parents who just, you know, are struggling but can't meet the needs, right? What's the line there? So I don't know, yeah. And the intuition piece too, like, I have a lot that stand out to me in terms of sexual abuse. That there was a feeling, right? Like, we all had this feeling that something is going on with this kid, but if they've never disclosed anything, if they've never, right, that investigating sexual abuse is really hard, and proving it is really hard. So yeah, it's there, but I feel like my intuition has never been substantiated because unfortunately you never sometimes know.
So whatever they do, like in that case where you make the call, you get an investigation done, and say there is an investigation, will you ever know the outcome?
You just know that it was indicated or not indicated, founded or unfounded. So they'll send you a letter. That's the way it worked in Illinois. I would get a letter, and I would get a letter like sometimes a year later.
Wow.
So I mean, like, I would have forgotten entirely.
Wow.
Oh, okay.
All I would know is that we made the call, and now it's it's CPS, Child Protective, right, in their hands. And, you know, sometimes it's because the investigation takes a long time, sometimes it's just because it's bureaucratic and, you know, it wasn't a high priority for them, so they never clear it out. You know, maybe there wasn't an immediate safety concern, and yeah, sometimes it would take them a week to respond to ones in which there wasn't an immediate safety concern. You know, and they would investigate, and at that point, whatever it was over, it would be unfounded. I'd get a letter. I mean, at least I would say 6 months later it would take me to get a letter. I could call the caseworker and check in if I was being really proactive about it. But
You said that some of these cases, they go nowhere. It's a call and they drop it. Do you think it's because the kids cover for the parents?
Well, so if they get investigated, it's not entirely dropped, right? Like it's, so there's that distinguish between I call and it doesn't get investigated, and that's because they have their criteria, right, at CYFD or wherever, in terms of what would warrant an investigation. So in Illinois, for example, like it was illegal to physically discipline your kids. You can hit them, right? You can even hit them with a belt. But the line was typically like they got hurt somehow, so marks would indicate an injury, right? So we would make a lot of calls where we didn't know exactly like how serious this was, but the kid would say, you know, I'm hit with this, I'm hit with that, and it seemed excessive. It was concerning, and so we might make a call, and they would say, oh, well, that's kind of within, you know, we'll document your call. If there are other concerns with the family, because maybe a neighbor calls, or maybe they're already in the system. So if there's other concerns that might trigger an investigation, but the call in and of itself maybe wasn't enough, right? Okay. Or some of those sexual abuse where I'd say, like, this kid has accidents all the time, they're super withdrawn, there's just something seems weird. But, you know, that's not enough to trigger. So there's that piece, they document it and don't investigate. Then there's the ones that they take and they investigate, but they don't find any evidence of. And those still stay in the system, so it still is documented that that family was investigated at some point. For a certain amount of time, they stay in there. But there's the other side, too, where, you know, and if you're parents, like, you can understand this, it's highly traumatic. It is for families to be investigated. And I recognize that in making those calls. It doesn't mean we don't do it. It doesn't mean that we don't protect kids, but also understanding that you know, that is it's a highly disruptive thing to families, and so for them to go through that if there wasn't anything going on it's terrifying to them. It really is.
So the stigma that comes with it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you understand why they would become hostile.
Yeah.
And which brings me to the next question.
Look how good she is.
How have you dealt with the hostile parents?
I think, yeah, you know, most of the hostile parents have not been around abuse. They've been more mad at us because of things that did or didn't happen at school. Like the most, like, in my face. Like, I'm furious at you.
What do you mean by, like, in your face because of what didn't or didn't happen?
Yeah, so, well, the one situation I'm thinking of, there was a girl who, she had been complaining about being bullied by another student, fifth grade girls. And the type of bullying was like this social kind of, you know, the other girl is telling people not to play with me or not to talk to me, or we used to be best friends, now we're not. They did used to be best friends, now we're not, and she's telling everybody else not to talk to me. I'm feeling very isolated, you know, and it was happening. I mean, it's not that it wasn't happening, but at the same time, the girl who was complaining was also doing the same thing, and she was also, like, provoking a lot. Like, she was doing things that the other kids didn't know how to handle. Like, she was saying, like, these awful things, and well, so she was saying terrible things to them, so yes, they were not playing with her. And, you know, it's not that it was entirely both sides, but it was complex, right? They were kids, they have bad social skills, they didn't know how to manage it. You know, it wasn't entirely a situation where someone had lots of power and someone had no power and they were just being targeted for no reason. It was complicated. And so what we did was we had tried to put in lots of interventions in place, and we did contracts and talked about, like, how are you going to do that? Like, you're not friends anymore. How are you going to share the friends that you used to be friends with, right? And offering them, like, you know, you can come in and bring a buddy into, like, the office or my office and just play games if you don't want to be on the playground, and maybe, you know. So we did a lot of that. We didn't contact the parents right away because stuff like this happens, like, this is like the bread and butter of working in a school. This happens all the time, and it didn't seem that, you know, significant. But then it kept going on. So at one point we did contact the parents and let them know, here's what's going on, here's, you know, what we've done so far, here's what we're going to do. Well, then it escalated even more, and the girl who felt that she was being bullied ended up drawing a picture of the other girl hanging from a tree in a notebook and leaving it out. Well, this is really problematic in schools given everything that goes on. And so that turned into, like, a disciplinary issue, right? And she, the principal understood that this whole situation had been ongoing. She didn't want to blow it out of proportion, but at the same time, if you're the parent of a kid who has a picture drawn of you hanging from a tree, you're going to be pretty upset if nothing gets done. So she ended up having the girl go home, like, suspended for the day. Having the girl go home, and then we were going to kind of process it the next day and work through it. So that parent was furious, and he was furious because apparently while I was dealing with the fact that she had drawn this picture of this other girl hanging from the tree, and I was trying to understand why she had done this, he had left me a message on my phone to share some more bullying that had happened the day before. I didn't get the message. He says if I had been in my office and had talked to him, that I would have been able to address it, and then she would have never drawn it. So that it was my fault somehow that she had drawn this picture. And he was, absolutely belligerent, screaming. The principal almost had to call the police. But what turned out happening is that it came out later that he was an alcoholic. There was a ton of turmoil in the home, and the girl who had felt that she was being bullied, they ended up taking her out of the school. They were so upset with the way we had handled it and all of that. She went to private school for about a year and then got kicked out of the private school, ended up back in the middle school, had issues there, ended up getting hospitalized and diagnosed with bipolar disorder about a year later. So I've seen a lot of that too in bullying situations where there's undiagnosed mental illness types of things that are going on. So that's the most angry parent I've had. The abuse situations, a lot of times, they're so embarrassed that they don't want to call to yell at somebody about it. The parents I've had who have been able to speak up about it have actually been, I've had a couple of parents who were social workers or teachers themselves, and their kid just said something that we had to call, unfortunately. We didn't really think that was probably abuse, but the kid said something that, even though we knew the family, you can't make exceptions for some families and say, oh, that's a nice family, right? And so we still made the call, and they still got investigated, and one of them was a social worker herself. And so she obviously, she was very tactful about it, but was upset. Yeah, so I haven't had a ton of furious parents over that, but it's usually because they're embarrassed. The one I had was a sexual abuse allegation, and the dad had to be taken out of the home for about 2 weeks. He was the primary caregiver, and the mom was pregnant at the time, and so it totally rocked their world, right? Mom had to leave work for a while, and it was just, but it was one where I really still feel like something was going on. And it ended up being unfounded because the little girl said, she got interviewed, and she said some pretty surprising things I think anyone would say, okay, that's enough evidence. And then at the end of the interview, she said, but I lie a lot. So they unfounded all of it. And that dad, we did a open house at school right after the investigation was over, after he had gone back into the home. We had the people who do good touch, bad touch presentations in the schools. We did a parents' night in the school. So I was obviously the one hosting it, and he showed up at the parents' night and asked a lot of really intense questions of the presenter, and then kind of confronted me after. But it wasn't hostile. It was just kind of a passive-aggressive kind of thing. So, yeah.
I know you mentioned in the previous class that kids are very hard to be credible for that reason, right?
Yeah, well, it's a really high threshold, and it's too bad because I don't think kids typically, they don't make that stuff up. 5-year-olds don't have that knowledge. They just don't. But, I guess based on the way the investigations work, if they say something like that, they can't, they can't go based off of only what they said, and they didn't have any other evidence. So, yeah.
You have experience here when you came to to Las Cruces. Did you continue working in schools?
I didn't. Well, I've been, I have connections with the schools through research and stuff, so I know some of the social workers here, but I haven't ever actually done direct service
So you
here.
don't have any experience as far as with immigration or anything like that?
No, well, it's a huge issue in Chicago, too. Okay. It's the same. So the community I worked in was pretty much demographically similar to here. So predominantly Latino, predominantly low-income community. I think we were 90% Latino in that suburb. So we had a number of undocumented families, and there were lots of issues that came up with that. So simple issues like the school wanted to require parents to have to show ID in order to get in as kind of a safety measure. It's problematic for people who don't have a driver's license, right? Or we would have parents who, nobody ever likes to follow the rules at drop off and pick up. If you have kids, drop off, right? It's total chaos, and nobody likes to wait for their kid. And so every once in a while, someone would get mad, and they tell the principal, you need to have police out there directing traffic. So she would call and ask, can one of the officers come over and just make sure that things are calm over here? And inevitably what would happen is that somebody would get pulled over for not stopping by the school bus or for blowing through a stop sign, and they wouldn't have a license, and they would be undocumented. And then the school will have caused somebody to be detained. It happened to 3 of my kids, that they had parents who ended up in detention because of things that happened like on school property, mostly traffic related. So yeah, I had a kiddo whose dad was in detention for like a year, and he had intense anxiety and trauma. And his dad came back. I'm not sure how they got it but he ended up coming back. But he had a lot of bad outcomes because of that. And then I had a family who was undocumented. I think I might have told you guys the story in class. The dad had a stroke, and he was the one who worked. So it was just, one thing after another after that, just a series of, and ultimately they were homeless. And everywhere that provides housing required either that you were a citizen or that you worked. And Mom couldn't work, she couldn't leave him, he couldn't work, and they weren't a citizen. So that was like the worst situation. But it just 0 resources available to them.
Going back to the immigrant child, the one that you said that had a lot of anxiety, how did you guys help him?
He, his mom she had a lot of resources, and she was really like on top of things and knew how to navigate things. She was a citizen. And so I don't know if Dad just had never, I think they weren't married, like it was that kind of a thing. So somehow they were able to get him some sort of status through her eventually. But, she was pretty connected and kind of knew. So she immediately, like to her credit, without us even doing anything, he was in therapy outside of school, and she was too, because it was just so hard for them. They went to family therapy, and they really liked their therapist, like had a good experience there. And then she really followed through too at school in terms of getting him a diagnosis so that he could get extra support at school, because it was starting to impact him. And he actually ended up being diagnosed with ADHD and some other things too that were impacting him at school. But it was really, a lot of it was about Mom. I think advocating for him and getting him services. And then he did groups with me at school, kind of anxiety management type of things, to support him there.
So, you think if the mother wouldn't have been as involved or know how to navigate, you think it would have been totally different?
I don't think we would have even known about this kid, because when you work somewhere where a lot of the kids are kind of behind in some way, in terms of like the expectation it wasn't where I worked that everybody was on grade level. A lot of kids struggled academically, and so he was a little bit behind, socially a little bit awkward, had anxiety, but he wasn't like throwing desks over. And so he probably wouldn't have stood out enough to teachers, because he was very sweet and very, kind of compliant, I guess, if that word makes sense. He probably wouldn't have stood out enough to teachers. We wouldn't have even known that had happened to him, I don't think, if Mom hadn't advocated for him.
I keep hearing in class how the support system is very important to have, so that we can... Okay.
Yeah, and he had Mom who was very... And then even Dad, they were really an impressive family, because I think typically there's understandably a ton of fear when there's immigration concerns. And they were very open, and they just kind of adopted a stance that like, we're gonna, we have rights, we have resources, we're gonna do what we can, and they were very open about what was going on. And I think that was helpful to him, because he didn't feel that pressure of, we can't even talk about this, he was able to talk about it. But I don't know how they got over that, because I think that fear is justified. So.
Were you ever in that situation where that, because of whether one of the parents got deported, did the child end up having any issues, like stayed there, or also would go with the family?
All of our kids stayed where we were, and a lot of them it was an issue of one parent had some sort of status, the other parent didn't. So yeah, I had a few where I know one where Mom ended up having to be in Mexico for quite some time, so Dad was taking care of them. And the other ones, most of them the family would be split, and one parent would have been deported or detained. I didn't have anywhere the kids ended up having to go. The only ones where I had kids who left were their mom died. She had a brain tumor, and so they had gone back to Mexico. She wanted to be with her family when she passed, so they went back there, but then they couldn't get back, so they ended up staying.
Have you worked with foster kids, when you know that they come from foster families?
Yeah. Do you want a story, or do you want
Tell me about the difference between, you know, a kid who is raised with their blood family versus a kid who comes in with foster parents.
Yeah. Well, obviously there's, I think, attachment issues no matter what. And they may not be severe, but like for any kid, there's this question of, you know, like what does this mean? And especially because foster care is often so temporary, and we would know lots of kids who would blow, you know, you go through multiple different homes, or so that's hard. And another thing I feel like I noticed, and I don't know, I haven't worked with people here, but I feel like in Illinois, the foster parents I worked with were really unprepared for the issues their kids were going to bring, like really unprepared. Like no one had ever talked with them about attachment, which seems bizarre to me that you would, you know, go put someone, you know, agree to be a foster, unless it's a family foster, and then I understand there's a little less training, but a lot of these people were people wanting to adopt out of foster care. And some of them, 2 of them I can think of, did end up adopting out of foster care, but really limited understanding of attachment. And so their kids had, understandably, a lot of behavioral concerns, but they would interpret everything as like a discipline problem. You know, so they, like one family I can think of, the kids would hoard food all the time. Because they had been neglected and they didn't always have access to food right before, and so that's a very common behavior that you would see in kids who had that experience, and just like in general, like much more independence. Like I'm gonna meet my needs when I can because like I know I can, so I'm gonna do it now. Yeah, but the mom like could not understand it, and so responded by like taking food away or like limit, and it was just a cycle, right? So then she would trigger this back for them that like, okay, I can't, my needs are not always going to be met. And so, yeah, just very, I think sometimes limited understanding, at least in my experience on the part of the foster parents, in terms of how important attachment was and how much that was triggering their behaviors as opposed to them being naughty or just wanting to do what they want to do, that kind of thing.
And you mentioned foster parents don't get the training. Do you think a lot of these foster parents come in just for the money?
Yeah, these ones didn't. And I'm thinking of, they did because they couldn't have their own children and wanted to adopt. And that's what brought them in. And the most of the others I'm thinking of, I'm just trying to think of my experience. No, you know, most of the other ones that I worked with at least were either family fosters, right? Family, like relatives in some way. Or they did it, a lot of them had kind of a religious, like they felt kind of a calling, I think, because of their faith or something. To do it, and so they kind of saw it in that perspective, and maybe, you know, some of them had adopted other children, and so they fostered in kind of out of a, you know, sense of that obligation in some way. But yeah, I don't know too many that I think probably did it for that. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. One kid that I taught when I was teaching, I know absolutely 100% that was probably what was going on with that particular foster setting and that kid. But
are you familiar with the training with these foster parents?
I don't know here. I mean, here it's, from what I've heard, there's a lot more attachment-specific stuff going on. And I think in general, you know, in the last 10 years maybe, there's more, obviously that's become trauma, like, and trauma-informed care and all of that has become much more important and much bigger part of the field. And so I think more of that's happening probably than when these families, you know, so this is probably 6 or 7 years ago, and maybe they went through their training, you know, maybe they were first certified or whatever to serve as foster parents before that. So I'm hoping things are different now. I don't know, though, exactly what that looks like. But I think there's more specific training.
And then we had another question. With families, was it hard sometimes knowing that you could, like, not being able to do more, being restricted?
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard, and it's also sometimes, like, the only way you can survive as a social worker. Because, you know, in a school, it's really limited. Schools have really strict policies around, like, what their professionals can do or should do. And so things are much more limited to within the school day. And there were times when, like, I would go to a family's house outside of school hours, or, you know, that mom who was undocumented, I drove her sometimes to her appointments, or I drove her to the DMV to see if we could, you know, that kind of stuff. But I was not, that was, like, not, I didn't tell anybody that I was doing those things. Unethical, yeah, I don't know, you know, like, sometimes it seemed necessary. And so it's hard because, like, yeah, you are really limited. Schools don't have really any resources to offer. All I could do is give people referrals, or, you know, other than saying, I can talk with you, I can talk with the kid. But at the same time, sometimes it is kind of, you need that to some degree. You need to be able to, like, understand your boundaries at times, because otherwise you can drive yourself crazy. Yeah, I mean, with the number of cases that you have and thinking through, like, it would be endless.
And how would you deal with those feelings once you got home? How would you turn them off, or what self-care?
I got better at it being a social worker than I was when I was a teacher. So I think I kind of like learned my lesson there. And I don't know. I mean, I think, I'm trying to think, like, what did I actually do that was different? I don't know. I mean, I think you just have to have a reasonable expectation of yourself, and you have to expect and understand that you can't control outcomes for people. You can offer, right, the supports that you have available, and you can do as much as you can within that, but ultimately you can't make something happen. You can't change circumstances. You can't, and if a family doesn't respond the way you would hope, or a kid doesn't respond the way you would hope, you can try something else, and you should. But, like, you're not, like, we're not like puppeteers. We can't control everything that goes on with people. And so I think just having reasonable expectations of yourself is important.
Okay. And then we have, how did you overcome difficulties working with certain clients at an individual level?
I think a lot of times when that happens, you look outside. I mean, sometimes, like, there was kids that, like, we just didn't get along. It happens with adult clients too. It's just not a good fit, right? Or the kid really didn't like me. Sometimes our kids are like, I don't want to go with her. Right? And we do everything we can, like, try to make it fun, whatever. Can you just come, let's play a game, whatever. Sometimes, and sometimes it's just because it's the social worker, they don't want to be with the social worker, or maybe there's, personally, there might be something about me that they didn't get along with, or there were kids that were harder for me to like, if you're being honest, like, there's clients that you'll like more than other clients, just because of who you are. So I think in those situations, you want to kind of look outside yourself as much as possible, and, you do everything you can, and work through that, but sometimes you need to pull in other resources or refer, or just find, different ways to approach a situation.
Would you, let's say you weren't able to work with a kid properly, would you try to switch with somebody else to see if that person might be able to get a better grasp with that child?
I would have if there was anyone else. That's the problem with schools, is that there's no one else in the school typically. I was pretty lucky that I even was full-time in one school. That's pretty unusual. Most people are split between 2 or 3 different schools, and they were just kind of all over. So that was the problem, right? The kids didn't have any choice. Like, if they were going to get social work, they got me. And some of the kids, like, I might have known them for 6 years, from kindergarten to 5th grade. So it gets a little old sometimes for them. So we would find other ways, like, maybe I would say, okay, like, listen, we're still having this concern. I still need to support your teacher. I need to support you somehow, like, 'cause things are still, you'd be honest with the kids, like, well, you don't want to see me, stop acting this way. I mean, sometimes it was kind of that, like, hey, listen, but as long as you act this way, people are going to think you need social work, and so you got to kind of, do your part. But sometimes I would go into the classroom where I'd be like, hey, you know what, we'll do something different. Like, our time might just be like, we'll take a walk or something. And you got to hold up your end of the bargain, though, and then not, engage in these behaviors or do whatever it was. So some flexibility. But yeah, I could refer them outside for extra, but I couldn't switch with anyone else because there wasn't anyone else.
And out of your training that you did in school to become a social worker, what specific theory or method did you say this helped me?
Yeah, I think attachment stuff is probably like the most one of the biggest. Well, because I mean, you learn a lot of behaviorism, and so I would still use a lot of that where you're looking at a situation and saying, okay, like, what are they getting out of this behavior? What is the consequence? What kind of feedback are they getting? Are they getting positive feedback when they act this way, and that's why they're still doing it? Or how can we change the environment? So that's like the first go-to, I think, most of what you do. But what?
Is it attachment theory?
Well, that's kind of behaviorist. So what I'm describing there is very like behavioral, kind of Skinner, right? Like those old things. And so you do a lot of that. But I think for me, what was more important was the kind of understanding attachment theory, because that changes things pretty dramatically. It changes the way you intervene. It's different if I see a kid as acting because they have some sort of unmet need in terms of attachment versus they're acting because they want attention. Yeah, in both cases they want attention, but it's a little bit different, right? Like I'm going to approach it differently if I understand it from an attachment perspective than if I understand it as, he's just seeking attention, so ignore that behavior, right? Ignoring things when there's an attachment problem doesn't work very well. So I think for me that's probably the most important thing. It's not always applicable in every situation, and it's not the way schools operate. They tend to operate from a very behaviorist perspective, but I think attachment theory, like knowing that when you work with kids, is probably one of the most important
Like
things.
bread and butter is the attachment.
Was it difficult to tell them apart between wanting attention and actually paying attention to something that's...
Yeah. Well, some of it too is just shifting the way you think about it. Like, so teachers be like, he just wants attention, right? So then, like, you have to ask, well, why? And why is he acting this? Like, everybody wants attention. All the kids in your class want attention. There's a reason that this kid is acting this way in order to get attention. Either he doesn't know how to get attention in a good way, or it doesn't work. Like, you ignore the good stuff. If people ignore the good stuff, then kids are going to act up in order to get attention. Or there's like an unmet need. So that's where like assessment is really important and understanding. And that's a lot of what I would do, right? A referral comes in, like this kid is doing X, Y, and Z. You go in and watch them. You watch what's happening before they do it. You watch what's happening after they do it. Does that seem to be the problem? Is something triggering it, or is something reinforcing the behavior? And then you talk with the kid, right? Or you talk with the teacher and kind of understand better. And then I think from that, that's where you kind of pick, like, what is your theory that you're going to explain it? Is it just a behavioral? Sometimes it is. But other times, right, it's because of something that may have nothing to do with the classroom.
How do you work with kids that have, like, authority issues? Like, where, you're on top of me, so I don't know what to do with you.
You just have to take that off the table. Like, you give them as much control as you can possibly give them about things that they can have control over in that setting. So when kids had those kinds of issues, like kind of oppositional defiant, we call them oppositional defiant disorder, that's what they would get diagnosed with. We give them lots of responsibility, lots of control over things that they can make decisions about. Do you want to do it this way or that way? Do you want to go here or there? Like, how do you want to do it today? So you avoid as much of like that power struggle as much, because you'll lose the power struggle every time. Yeah, I mean, ultimately that's what it comes to, especially with kids who will get physical. If a kid is willing to get physical, I'm not going to get physical back with the kids. So they'll win the power struggle. So you really just kind of try to remove yourself from it and be non-reactive and like kind of just, okay, that's the way it is. If you choose this, then here's the consequence if there is a consequence, or, here's why you can't do that, because if you do that, you don't have these privileges anymore. It's not safe. And then beyond that, try to give people as much choice as they can have so that need gets met, because they obviously have a need for control. So, yeah.
Was there any laws that you would like to change to better protect children?
Yeah, that was a good question, too. I would say more of it is, more on the end of laws around letting families have better resources, as opposed to, like, more specific laws around child abuse. Because there's interesting unintended consequences with reporting laws. I mean, not that I agree that we should all be reporting child abuse, I do, but there's unintended consequences when you increase, like, say that you have to report this, or, what ends up happening sometimes is that systems get stressed, like the centers get so many calls, or they have so many investigations, they're investigating things that may not really be abuse, because people are worried and obligated to call, and so sometimes the resources get stretched even thinner, and sometimes things fall through the cracks even more. And then, right now in New Mexico, they're talking about, which I don't disagree with, like increasing the penalties for child abuse and, all of that. I certainly don't disagree with it, but at the same time, people don't not abuse their kids because they're worried about getting in trouble. Like, the reason the abuse happens is because there's a lack of, right, whether it's parenting skills or a lack of resources and people are too stressed or whatever it is. So for me, right, I mean, nobody, I don't think, I've never met anybody who wants to abuse their kids, right? And they do it because, even if they're angry and they don't see a problem with it, they do it because there's some kind of issue with their skills or their resources. And so again, I'm not opposed to higher penalties, but I don't think that changes anything. Because I don't think anyone makes that decision like, oh, I'm going to stop right here because I might go to jail. Like, if that was the case, they wouldn't be doing it in the beginning. Right. So I think it's more about laws to make it easier for families to access resources
That's what I was gonna say. Nobody's gonna be like, oh, this one's gonna give me 10
Yeah.
years, so better
10 years
not.
instead of 15, or 15 instead of 10, or, oh, that kid's older, I better not beat that one. I don't think that happens. I don't think there's a decision-making process, but I could be wrong. I've never experienced it. Mm-hmm.
My question is, what are the top theories that you see that you used in school?
I think those two, behaviorism, and I don't know how much, is that what you guys have called it in class? Have you learned, like?
Behavioralism?
Yeah, that and attachment theory.
Okay.
We kind of really attachment.
Yeah. Do you have to go?
In
I
a
know we
couple
took
minutes,
up a lot
yeah,
of
sorry,
time already.
Tony. But if you want to kind of ask a couple more, we can wrap up.
As a parent, has being a social worker helped you in any way? Benefited you in any way?
Yes and no. Sometimes it's like a little bit of a bad thing. Sometimes well, no, not bad, but sometimes I can see in myself, like, I'm not doing what I should be doing. I'm doing exactly what I would tell myself not to do. And so it's annoying to recognize that, because sometimes I should be like, no, like, I know I shouldn't be doing this, I know I shouldn't have said that, or I know I'm like totally reinforcing this behavior with what I'm doing, but I'm still doing it and I know better. So I don't know if that's good or bad. But sometimes it's helpful, because like my son, who's having major toileting issues, he just got potty trained, and so we've been struggling. He will not, like, he has accents at school all the time. And he just doesn't care. Like, he doesn't care, like, he's wet, his pants are wet, he's like, whatever, he won't tell anyone. He's happy, he's not embarrassed. He just doesn't care. He's, like, not at a stage where he cares yet, but he has to be potty trained to be at school. And so I've been like, my husband was like very, he was trying like rewards and consequences kind of thing, and like, he didn't care about the rewards or consequences either. Like, well, that's great if I get the reward. He was happy, but it wouldn't motivate him to not be in his pants. And so I was trying, like, thinking back, and I'm like, okay, so he doesn't, like, there's this basic principle that you kind of operate on when you're working with behavior that is, like, when people do what they can. If they know how to do it, they do it. So when we're thinking about kids who are acting out, it's because there's something, they don't know how to do the right thing. If they knew how to do the right thing, they would do it, right, in that setting. So I'm like, okay, he doesn't know how to do the right thing. And, like, what it came down to, I think we figured out, he has no awareness of, like, what it felt like to need to go to the bathroom. He had never developed that. So we, like, did some stuff where I would, like, show him, like, a Ziploc baggie full of water. Like, this is, like, what your bladder is like, right? See, it's really full. And look, if I put more water in it, then it pours out, like, it explodes. That's what happens when you're having an accident. And so, like, you need to go, like, you need to let a little bit out, like, ahead. And so, like, when we would, like, rate it, like, I'd check on him throughout the day, like, how full is your bladder? Is it a 0? Like, you could go right now and nothing would come out? Or is it a 1 or a 2? 2's like, you're going to have an accident. So, and now within a couple of weeks of doing that, he'll say, like, I feel the pressure, and he'll run to the bathroom.
That's cute.
So things like that. That's been helpful, I think, to just reframe.
Wow.
Another one I guess we can try to ask is, here in Las Cruces, what do you think is a issue in our community?
From the people that I've talked to in the community, there's a lack of resources. There's a lack of mental health resources because of everything that's in the state in general, because of everything that's happened in the last few years. And so it's really hard to get people the help they need. And then from some of the work I've just done in the community, there's really fundamentally like a lack of good jobs and kind of just like the infrastructure to support families generally so that they aren't having to seek out other resources.
How do we change that?
And education, right? So like a lot of parents and families with low education, right? They don't have good job prospects, and so they're inevitably kind of struggling or needing other resources.
Well, we're talking about lack of resources, like, how do we change that? Is that all about policy or funding?
Yeah, I think it is a lot about policy and funding, yeah. Well, and I think finding ways, it's hard. I think the state in general needs to figure out how can we attract, right? Like, how can, because it gets so much bad press, and I think that's got to be not helpful in terms of improving things. And actually, I read something the other day about, like, even though we're always last and everything, actually kids they kind of outperform educationally where we would expect them to be. It's not good, but given, like, how poor the state is, given how, all these other factors that we know are really low, kids aren't doing that badly in school in terms of their actual, they're kind of outperforming where we might expect them to be. So hopefully in the future things get better. But I think also we need to keep people here, right? People leave people who
Mhm.
get those skills leave. So.
Last, I mean, I know you have to go, right? Any tips for us
In general,
in general
On
as
being a
social
social
workers? Any tips?
I
Anything we should?
don't know. You just
keep
have to find ways to enjoy your clients. I think that's like the thing I miss the most. Like kids are really fun, or or whatever it is, wherever you end up working. Like you have to find what it is about it that's like really cool. So I was just like reading old stuff that I wrote down, like just the hilarious things kids would say, and like that, like that, because it's really hard work. So you have to find what sustains you. And for me, that's what it was like.
I know I have to leave, Dr. Gherardi. The ones that we didn't answer, is there any way I could email them
Yeah,
to you?
email
in
them to you and I'll
response,
write them
I'll
out.
send them out to everybody.
Okay.
Thank
Perfect.
you.
Thank you so much.
Dr.
Thank
Gherardi.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.